Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're talking about bread, and you love that. You. Yeah, I can see you. You eat too much bread. Stop it, says the Italian man. Alright, so we're back with Townsends. We reacted to one of their videos about hardtacks a while ago, which I thought was fantastic. I love this channel, very wholesome. But today, they're talking about the most important job in the world, the baker. And I mean, can't fault the logic, can we? Let's go. Hit me with the facts.
You are the most important person in town. You are the most important person in town. You hold your local society together. The men and women in your community who work every day to feed their families depend on you. Without you, people will go hungry, even homeless. There would be civil unrest, riots in the streets, if it wasn't for your constant routine. The very fabric of humanity is woven together by your hands. Can you believe all of this is because of bread?
Man, what an introduction. I mean, the man is right. Well, first of all, bread. It's not just a staple of so many cultures, so many nations, so many different, like it really is like a common denominator in a lot of different varieties and versions, but like from India to Europe to anywhere really, it's just made sometimes of different ingredients with different shapes and whatnot. But yeah, Africa, everywhere, like bread is literally everywhere, but it is ancient. I'll talk a bit more about that, but let's see how it's going, because now he's going the route with this presentation is going the route of the baker, of course, as the title suggests. I'll talk a little more about bread in itself as an invention when it comes to mankind and history, but let's see what else he's going to say. I loved the intro.
As a baker, you have a responsibility to your community to be able to bake this bread, bake it well, bake it to a certain standard. And in many situations, the baker took an oath in front of the community because this is the most important job in the world. Not just anyone can become a baker. You almost have to be born into the trade. Many people started off as an apprentice. And not just anyone can be an apprentice. You really have to be strong enough for this trade. You're carrying around heavy sacks of flour. You're carrying around huge baskets of bread in the streets to sell them. You start off young as a baker.
You know, if I gotta check his comments, because if someone who is a baker is watching this must be like the greatest self-confidence boost. Like it really, I love that. I love that a baker may be watching this, because bakers even today, of course, we are discussing now, I don't know, usually he talks about like the 1700s, 1800s. I think that's mostly his focus. But when talking bread, we can go back to the ancient Romans. In fact, bread was ancient in ancient Rome. Like for the Romans, bread was already an ancient invention. It's really difficult to pinpoint it in time and say definitively bread was invented X thousand years ago. We can have some guesses. Ancient Romans and Greeks did have bread. Mesopotamians had bread. Akkadians had bread. The Egyptians had bread together with beer. Oftentimes they do develop together, because at the end of the day, I mean, bread in itself, it's not a complicated invention. It's the idea is we have these plants, we can't eat them. Well, we have a lot of these. What do? We'll destroy reduce them into a powder. Great. Can we eat that? Yes, but it sucks. So mix it with water. And then there is the addition of yeast, and that's why I'm saying it oftentimes works in conjunction with beer, because beer provides you with that yeast that then you can put there and then create bread the way we understand it. Flatbreads could also be created, of course. Very likely that they invented that one, maybe by accident. A lot of inventions happen by accident, or maybe because they knew what they were doing when it comes to the yeast. And it's interesting that beer oftentimes is regarded as liquid bread. It's another way to consume a plant that they had, most likely since the Neolithic period and the introduction of agriculture, for obvious reasons. I say most likely because it's possible that maybe some would be used in the wild before settled hunter-gatherers, but still. And you can really go as far back as who knows when.
Bakers in a community are part of a guild. So much so that they even turn out for parades, and they're all together and dressed all in the same way in a uniform. And in this guild situation, the bakers in the community have to compete against one another, but also support one another as they work within that community.
Yeah.
Why was the baker important? Why didn't people just bake bread at home?
Yeah, good luck without the oven. That's another big thing.
Everyone has an oven in their home. In fact, most people don't have an oven in their home, and they certainly can't afford to fire it every day. It takes a lot of fuel to fire up a little tiny oven. The baker has a huge oven. He has to start that oven up in the morning, but it bakes for the entire town.
And that's still similar to bakers today. They wake up at crazy hours and literally their lives are dedicated to it. I know that because we know this baker back in Sicily, and he wakes up like at 4 in the morning every day and then has to go in there, and you don't see him until 10 in the evening. And then I imagine he goes home and goes to bed immediately because he's probably tired. Rinse and repeat for like 30, 40 years. But then again, with this much sacrifice, and excellent bread, by the way, Sicilian bread is like, ooh, that level of sacrifice, he managed to send all of his daughters and children to university, to college, to school, and now they do, jobs that required a certain level of education. But I think it's impressive. I have a lot of gratitude towards bakers today. Even in this highly industrialized society, there still are very traditional jobs, one of which is this, that require a lot of sacrifice.
And not just bread, but people will bring other things to the baker to have them baked. You might bring a big cake. You might bring a whole haunch of venison. The customer is everyone in town, from the richest house to the poor house. And it's interesting that there's a loaf of bread that represents each level of society. Yes. Whether it's the most refined bread for the rich person's table or the coarsest dark loaf for the poorhouse.
Yep.
The reason why bread is so important is it's the one thing the everyday man can survive upon. And he doesn't need to cook it. He can just buy it and eat it, and that's it. That's all he really has to have. We will find journal entries where an author will talk about a meal that seems very complete, and he will complain about the lack of bread.
Sounds like an Italian. An Italian will complain about the lack of bread at every meal, lunch, dinner, anything. If there is no bread, the Italian is like, what? I can't eat now. You know what's interesting is that bread, if you really look at it, even though sometimes linguistically this can be a little deceiving, bread is everywhere. Because hardtack, that of course he has a video on, Max Miller has a video on, it's bread. It's just hard bread that is dehydrated and doesn't rise. It's still bread though. So hardtack, so bread was used in a different form to give it to sailors on top of ships, and to give it to the military, like the Romans had hardtack. And the reason why that was preferable, and even today, I mean, bread goes stale very quickly. So imagine if you are on the march or you're on a ship for months, you need to be able to carry your bread, but it should not get moldy and it should not get stale, and therefore it's very good to dehydrate it, and that makes it last for a lot longer. But that's still bread. Bread really has all sorts of variants, and pizza is a form of bread, right? We give it different names, but it's all bread.
That's how important it was. As the baker, you're required to bake 3 kinds of bread for the community. You bake a white bread, sometimes called fine bread.
Yep.
You bake a middling bread, and sometimes it's called middling or just wheaten bread. And then a low-class bread, a cheap bread, brown bread, and it was generally called household bread. Here's our fine wheat bread. This is the one everybody wants. And it's sort of a plain bread. You expect to put butter on this. It's not.
Depending on the area, could be butter or olive oil. I think butter was more common in Northern Europe, whereby olive oil would have been more common in Southern Europe, such as whether it be Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, Spain. Of course, I'm now talking a little bit about the medieval period or the classical antiquity, but in general, before the modern period, food would have always been seasonal and food would have been regional specific. So it's not just a matter of there would have been a difference because of the time, a time difference between the modern period and the past, but there would have been a massive regional variety. Today, we can eat anything outside of their season, and we can eat anything regardless of provenance. But in the past, yeah, there were some spices that could be traded, but they were very expensive. And but there were foods that would have been regional. He's mentioning something now that sounds very Anglo-Saxon, very Nordic. In the Mediterranean, that would have been instead most likely done with olive oil or some other kind of pastes, or even ancient forms of pesto to give it flavor. Fruit, eating fruit with bread would be like something we don't really do these days. We should start doing it again. You should have fruit with bread today.
Full of flavor. This is our wheaten bread, the middling bread, the less expensive bread.
I still like it.
And it has that nice wheat flavor, just a little more dense. It's actually more flavorful. We come down to the very inexpensive household bread. This is the bread poor people can actually afford. It's less than half the price. And it is a dense meal. It is full of flavor. It's got that wonderful bran that comes through, which is the thing that gets thrown out of the white bread. You're getting the full meal in a slice of bread.
Whole grain would have been the one that was cheaper. And then sometimes people, though, and it's true that that happens, sometimes people, however, kind of push this idea that whole grain is the best one. It's the better one for you, is the one that it's good for your body, whereas because with white bread, we throw away all the things that are good for you. But I've watched a few videos from professionals, actual scientists and food experts, and they say that that's a bit of a myth. There isn't that much of a difference between how good for you bread is between whole grain bread. And I'll see if I can find a video and put a link in the description, since I'm no professional. But the professionals kind of debunk this idea. The whole grain bread is just the one that is really, really good for you. And there is a massive difference because of all the vitamins and all the good stuff that is in there. It appears to be mostly a myth. There isn't that much of a difference. There is a difference in flavor, though, and so that's it, which, by the way, it's kind of a whether you like it or not, depending on your personal taste, because some people don't like that. Like my mom, my dad don't really like the taste of whole grain bread. I like it, but then again, I like all sorts of taste for bread. I think the reason why white bread has become the one that we like the most is because it doesn't cover the flavor of the stuff that you put and you eat with it. I believe that's the reason. And maybe the aesthetics, because it kind of looks better. You know, one thing that I want to add to that, as we were discussing the idea of bread being invented, such an important invention, who knows when, who knows where, and I wish we could know. Because if you really think about it, we know the names of all those horrible people in history that ended millions of lives, and yet we don't know the name of the first person in history who invented something that provided and fed billions. In fact, the number is incalculable, because you can imagine all the people that were affected in the future, right? So for all those centuries and millennia and tens of thousands of years, so we don't know their name. Of course, it's basically impossible not to mention. I don't think the bread was invented specifically in one area and then it was moved around and copied. Yes, but I also think it's an invention that very likely occurred spontaneously, independently in various areas of the world. But still, there has to be one person, could be a man or a woman, really depending. If most likely we're talking about a tribal society, it could either be a man who was the baker for whatever reason, he was the one that was supposed to do that, or it could be that it was a woman's job and the men were doing something else, like fighting or maybe scouting or, who knows, hunting and foraging. Because I mean, it's not like hunting and foraging completely stops even during sedentary society with agriculture. Meat is still provided. So it could have been a woman, who knows. But whoever it was, the individual that first in the history of mankind came up with the idea, I want to eat that plant. What can we do? Because we have plenty of that. I wish we could know who it was, and we could memorize their names and maybe even imagine, who knows, maybe they would have been somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, somewhere in Africa, somewhere in, who knows, like it's impossible to know where this happened, somewhere in Europe, in the Americas. There is no way to know. But whoever it was, I wish we had their names, and it would be nice to have our kids memorize their names in honor of what they did.
As the baker, you face many challenges, and one of the foremost is regulation.
Right.
Bread has been regulated for thousands of years. The Romans regulated bread.
Correct.
And they're regulating many different aspects. Exactly what goes in your bread. Is it white bread? Is it brown bread? Is it household bread? And you're regulating the weight of the bread. your bread has to weigh a certain amount. Your bread also has to be a particular price. And your bread has to be marked. Each and every loaf has to have an initial on it.
I love that they actually do it, man. I love this. Is like reenactment 101. The Romans regulated everything. Goodness gracious, the Romans and regulations is insane. I can only imagine like a non-Roman, a barbarian, moving into a Roman city and then getting overwhelmed by all the bureaucracy and all of the regulations that the Romans said about everything.
You are, as the baker, it also has to say what kind of bread it is, and it might even say how much the bread is supposed to weigh. And if you don't put these marks on your bread may be forfeit and given to the poorhouse. There are also challenges with seasonality and supply. Bread is very difficult to bake if it's too cold outside. You need to proof your bread, that yeast needs to work, and if it's too cold, it just will not rise. Yeast is a problem when it's cold or it's warm. The brewer, where the yeast comes from, he's giving you yeast at the best time of year, either in the spring or more likely in the fall. But when it gets to be cold winter time, he's not brewing beer and you don't have a supply of yeast. There were times when yeast was in great demand and it was very difficult to get a hold of. You will
not to mention, famine and war interfere with all of this a lot.
We'll have problems getting a hold of flour. We have crop failures. Maybe the weather is cold or wet and the wheat crop is a failure, and the flour that finally comes to you is a very low quality and hardly works for bread at all. The baker has to be quick on his feet. He has to be able to make substitutions, still within the law, and bake bread for people who want it every single day. If you do not get people the bread that they require, there will be civil unrest, and at times even violence against your shop and your person, because they want bread now. And there are even bread riots recorded throughout history. It's one of the reasons why bread is regulated so tightly. As the baker, what do you do when you can't get enough flour to bake your bread, or it's too expensive?
You don't make wheat bread, you make something else. Maybe he's going to mention barley. If he does, I've got some stuff to say.
This happens many times, and there are certain things you can do. Most of them, well, they don't quite meet with all the regulations. You can add other kinds of flour in. Maybe you're going to add barley flour.
There we go. So barley was considered in ancient Rome, as we have mentioned a few times on this channel, but just in case you're new here today, barley was considered very, very badly by the Romans. They thought it was good for animals or slaves. So if you give an ancient Roman a barley bread, it would be an insult. And it did happen in the military. Like in the military, the Romans were given a certain amount of wheat per month so that they could use to produce their own bread, because Romans baked their own bread. They even had usually one little oven that they would share between two contubernia, so 16 men, and they would usually share 1 by 2 or 1 per contubernium. It's kind of difficult to read the sources on that. My guess is 1 shared by 2 makes more logical sense. And then they would have to bake their own bread. Sometimes they would bake soft bread. Other times they would use the wheat to bake more bucellatum, which is basically the Roman version of the hardtack that then they can rehydrate and soften by putting it in the sort of porridge called pulse that the Roman soldiers would eat with some addition of cheese or lard. But when the Roman soldiers were being punished, the ration of wheat would be substituted for a ration of barley. This is how badly the Romans thought of barley. Sometimes I even wonder why, because at the end of the day, if you give me barley, I mean, I love a barley cup myself.
Or rye flour into your bread. It isn't exactly what the regulations say, but in certain circumstances, it's the only thing you can do.
Yeah.
There are other times when you add things into your bread to make them look whiter. So
I like chalk.
They would add alum to the bread, or they would add chalk to the bread.
There you go. Yeah.
There might be several reasons to do this. Sometimes you're just putting an inexpensive ingredient in and one that weighs a lot.
Yeah,
so
the weight.
You can make your bread cheaper. Or if you can't get enough wheat, you might add that chalk to it so that it actually rises better. It's against the law. If you get caught, you will be punished.
I mean,
If a baker or brewer be guilty not to have observed the assize for the first, second, or third fault, he shall be fined, except for the offense be grievous and often, and then shall the baker to the pillory.
wow.
The reality is that bakers break.
Wait, what's the pillory? I want to know. A wooden framework with with holes for the heads and hands, the one that we see, in which an offender was imprinted and exposed to yeah, okay. Yeah. So it's not like as bad as the gallows, but sure, we saw that in Kingdom Come Deliverance too, didn't we? Yeah, that's it. That thing. Okay, cool. And it's free, look at that.
Breaking the law isn't all that common. This profession is
burnt.
one that is very fulfilling. The community needs bread.
I just love the crust when it comes out.
I love the crust too. Like for me, the end of a baguette is the best part.
Earthen oven. They're so different than anything else.
You can smell a difference when it comes out of the earthen oven, and the texture is different. I think it has to do with that trapped moisture that you just don't get in a modern oven.
Yeah.
Bakers were looked up to because of what they provided to the community. You're providing nutrition, fuel for the working man, survival for the poor. What you do is truly the most important job in the world.
Wow. I don't remember the last time I ate so much bread.
Very
You
nice.
are the most important.
Very nice. Let me check the comments. There we go. I knew it. I'm a baker by trade, and I have been for the last 15 years. This last month, I've been considering doing something else, but this encourages me to keep getting up at midnight. Oh my goodness gracious. To keep doing what I know deep down in my heart is my favorite thing to do. I'm going to watch this every time I feel like giving up. Thank you, John. That's wonderful, very wholesome. All right, number ones, but I hope that you enjoyed this video. I certainly did. I really liked Townsend's video. As usual, feel free to subscribe, check him out, watch. I know I watched the whole video. Usually I don't, but I just got passionate about it. But it is a very successful channel, and this is a video that is 2 years old. So I think a little exception to my usual rule, whereby I don't watch the entirety of the video as to encourage people to go and watch it. You'll still find a link in the description and the pinned comment. And of course, there are plenty of videos so you can go and watch if this is the first time you hear of that channel today. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you, Townsends, for the video, and I hope you enjoyed my addition and commentary. See you tomorrow. Bye.